1998, a young girl from a small American town was enjoying a peaceful afternoon, playing in her backyard while her mother tended to laundry inside. But when the mother went to check on her daughter just moments later, she was gone, vanished without a trace. Nearly 3 years passed without any answers. Then, after a heavy rainfall flooded a local swamp, a volunteer cleanup crew unearthed something shocking buried deep in the mud, something that would both haunt the investigators and reveal an unimaginable truth. The sun was just rising, casting a warm glow through Sarah Whitmore's kitchen window as she cracked eggs into a bowl, the sound of her whisking breaking the silence, a silence that had filled the house for 3 long years. At 42, Sarah had learned to live with the emptiness, but mornings were still the hardest. Emma, her daughter, had always been the first to wake, her wild blonde curls bouncing as she rushed into the kitchen, demanding butterfly-shaped pancakes. But today, as Sarah lost herself in the quiet routine, the shrill ring of the phone pierced her thoughts. It was too early. 7:23 a.m. Hesitant, she reached for the receiver. "Sarah Whitmore," she answered. The voice on the other end was calm, but professional. "Ma'am, this is Detective Carl Morrison from the Pine Ridge Police Department. I'm sorry to call so early, but we need you to come down to Blackwater Swamp." Blackwater Swamp. It was a place Sarah had only heard of in passing, 15 miles outside their small Oregon town, an area locals usually avoided because of its dense wetlands and tangled trees. "Ma'am, what's this about? We've had our volunteer cleanup crews working in the flood zones after last week's heavy rains. They found something. We believe it might be connected to Emma's case." Sarah's hand trembled as the phone slipped from her ear. "You found her," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "We found remains," the detective continued, his voice steady but filled with a weight that Sarah could feel. "Small remains. I'd rather not discuss further details over the phone, but we need you to come identify some items." Sarah's legs buckled beneath her, and she sank onto the kitchen stool. Eggs spilled across the counter. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, her voice shaky but determined. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to prepare you. It will be difficult. Do you have someone who can drive you?" "I'll manage," she replied, the words stronger than she felt. After the call ended, Sarah stood in her kitchen, frozen. 3 years of searching, hoping, and endless waiting. And now, this. She moved instinctively to the drawer where she kept Emma's file, the well-worn manila folder filled with police reports, photographs, and newspaper clippings. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her keys. The drive to Blackwater Swamp felt endless. The familiar streets of Pine Ridge faded away as Sarah passed through rural highways, the road narrowing as she ventured deeper into the dense coastal forest. The morning mist clung to the trees, and the ground was slick from the rain. As she approached the swamp, her stomach tightened at the sight ahead. Police vehicles lined the muddy access road, their lights flashing in the fog, casting an eerie glow. Crime scene tape cordoned off a large section near the water's edge. People in protective gear moved with purpose. Sarah parked and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. Through her windshield, she saw Detective Morrison, tall and graying, the lead investigator who had worked on Emma's case from the start. He spotted her and walked toward the car. "Sarah," he said, opening the door. His expression was grave, yet kind. "Thank you for coming." "Where is she?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "This way." Detective Morrison guided her through the crime scene, his hand gently on her elbow. The floodwaters washed away years of sediment. A volunteer found it this morning, a vintage oven, partially buried in the mud. Sarah's mind couldn't process the words. An oven. They reached the inner perimeter, where forensics teams were working. On a blue tarp lay an old red oven from the 1960s. Its enamel was chipped and faded, still visible beneath the layers of rust and mud. The door was sealed shut with industrial adhesive. Inside, they found small bones, too small. Laid out on an evidence table were clear bags containing what looked like remnants of Emma's favorite dress, a white lace collar, scorched but still recognizable. No! The word escaped Sarah's lips as a whisper, then a scream. She collapsed to the ground, her hands clawing at the mud, unable to process the heartbreak. Emma had worn that dress to her 6th birthday party just 2 months before she vanished. It had been her princess dress, the one Sarah had promised she could wear to church. Detective Morrison knelt beside her, his eyes filled with sorrow. Around them, the forensics team continued their work, but for Sarah, the world had stopped. The swamp had fallen silent, save for Sarah's heartbreaking sobs. The distant calls of mourning birds echoed through the air, their indifference only amplifying the gravity of her grief. Still kneeling in the mud, Sarah struggled to process the incomprehensible reality before her. But then, through the controlled chaos of the crime scene, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Sarah, oh God, Sarah!" She looked up, her tear-filled eyes focusing on her ex-husband, Mark Whitmore, pushing past the perimeter tape. His face was a blend of shock and grief, the usually composed features now shattered as he took in the sight before him. He was still in his hardware store uniform, the red vest embroidered with Whitmore's Hardware on the chest. "Sir, you can't—" A uniformed officer moved to stop him. "That's my daughter," Mark's voice cracked. "I heard on the radio. They said remains at Blackwater Swamp. That's my little girl." Detective Morrison looked between Sarah and Mark before nodding to the officer. "It's okay. He's Emma's father." Without hesitation, Mark rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside Sarah in the mud. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her to him. "We'll get through this together," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, just like we always promised we would for Emma. Overcome by grief, Sarah leaned into his embrace, her walls crumbling. The 3 years of divorce seemed to fade away as the familiar scent of Mark's plaid shirt, sawdust and coffee washed over her, reminding her of days when home still felt whole. Detective Morrison crouched beside them, his voice professional yet gentle. "I know this is incredibly difficult, but I need to explain what happens next. We'll need to run DNA tests to confirm the identification, but given the size of the remains and the dress fragments—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The likelihood is very high that this is Emma." Mark tightened his arm around Sarah. "How long until you know for certain?" "The initial tests will take about 72 hours. The full forensic examination will take longer," Morrison said, his eyes filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry. I wish I had better news." Mark helped Sarah to her feet, still keeping his arm around her waist. "We should go through Emma's case files again," he said, addressing both Sarah and the detective. "Now that there's new evidence, maybe we missed something, some detail that could help you find who did this." Morrison nodded. "That would be helpful. Sometimes fresh eyes on old evidence can reveal connections we didn't see before." Sarah wiped her muddy hands on her jeans, trying to regain some composure. "The files are at my house," she said, her voice distant, detached. "I'll follow you there," Mark said quickly. "We can go through everything together." In silence, they walked back to their vehicles, Mark helping Sarah navigate the uneven ground. The forensics team resumed their grim work, photographing and cataloging every detail of the scene. Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, staring blankly ahead before starting the engine. As she glanced in her rearview mirror, she saw Mark climbing into his truck, following her. The drive back to Pine Ridge felt like a blur. Before she knew it, Sarah found herself at her house, the same 1970s ranch-style home where Emma had vanished from the backyard. She didn't even remember the drive. Mark's truck pulled into the driveway behind her. Inside, the house felt suffocating. Every corner seemed to hold a memory of Emma. Her artwork still magneted to the refrigerator, the marks on the kitchen door frame showing how much she'd grown, her favorite cereal still in the pantry because Sarah couldn't bring herself to throw it away. "I'll make coffee," Mark said, moving to the kitchen with the ease of someone who once lived there. Sarah mechanically retrieved the case file from the kitchen drawer and spread its contents across the dining room table. Police reports, witness statements, photos, maps marked with search grids. 3 years of desperate searching now laid out in neat piles. Mark returned with 2 mugs, setting one near Sarah's hand. September 15th, 1998, he read from the top of the report, though they both knew every word by heart. "Emma was playing in the backyard while you were doing laundry. I checked on her every 10 to 15 minutes, Sarah recited, the familiar guilt washing over her. She had her dolls out by the swing set, having a tea party. At 3:30 p.m., you went to check again, and she was gone." Mark continued, his voice thick with emotion. "The back gate was open. I know I latched it. I always latched it." He reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "No one blames you, Sarah. Whoever took her knew what they were doing." Mark pulled out his own alibi documentation. "I was at the store. 3 employees saw me, plus the security cameras showed me at the register until 5:45. Sarah's eyes moved over the photos of Emma spread across the table, her daughter's bright smile frozen in time. Mark picked up one photo in particular, Emma in her red velvet dress at her 6th birthday party, chocolate cake smeared on her cheek. "That red dress," Mark said softly, his finger tracing Emma's image. "She wanted to wear it everywhere." "Remember how Emma tried to wear it to the grocery store?" Sarah whispered, her voice almost breaking. "I had to hide it sometimes just to wash it." Mark nodded slowly, setting down the photo. "Whoever took her, they must have been watching, knowing our routines, when you do laundry, when the neighborhood would be quiet." Sarah sighed, the same haunting thought that had plagued her for 3 years coming back. But everyone was questioned. Every neighbor, every delivery person, everyone who'd been near our street. Mark paused, thinking, "Maybe we need to think differently now," he suggested. "With this new evidence, maybe there's a pattern we didn't see before." They sat together at the table, the same table where they'd once shared family dinners, now surrounded by the cold documentation of their worst nightmare. The files they'd pored over for years, police reports, witness statements, photos, maps, were spread out in front of them, pieces of the puzzle they'd been trying to solve. After Mark left to give her some space, Sarah found herself alone in the house, the weight of the case files still pressing down on her. She tried to focus on the reports, but her mind kept returning to that grotesque image, the red oven, sealed with layers of industrial adhesive, sitting on the blue tarp like some kind of monstrous cocoon. There was something about it, something that nagged at her beyond the obvious horror, the color perhaps, or the style. She picked up her phone and dialed Detective Morrison's direct line. He answered on the second ring. "Morrison here." "Detective, it's Sarah Whitmore. I need to ask you something about the oven." "Of course. What do you need to know?" "Could you send me photos of it? Close-ups, if you have them. Something about it feels familiar." There was a brief pause. "Familiar? How?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe it's just my mind trying to make connections, but I'd like to study it more carefully. I can email you the preliminary photos we took at the scene. Give me about 10 minutes. Sarah powered up her old Dell laptop, the bulky machine taking what felt like forever to boot up. While waiting, she cleared space on the dining table, pushing aside the papers she and Mark had been reviewing. When the email finally came through, she opened the attachment to find 6 high-resolution photos. The oven filled her screen in vivid detail. Despite the rust and mud, the distinctive cherry-red enamel was still vibrant in places. The chrome handles, Art Deco in style with elegant curves, marked it as a premium model from decades past. She zoomed in on the manufacturer's plate, Westinghouse. The model number was partially obscured by corrosion, but it was enough for Sarah to print out the photos. The colors were slightly off on her inkjet printer, but they were clear enough for her to study. The red of the oven was so specific, not fire engine red, not burgundy, but something in between, almost candy apple in tone. Her thoughts raced. She grabbed the photos and her purse, making a decision. There were several appliance stores in Pine Ridge, including vintage specialty shops that catered to the town's historic district. Her first stop was Modern Appliance on Main Street. The young salesman glanced at the photos with polite interest, but shook his head. "That's way before my time, ma'am. Maybe try Retro Kitchen down on Oak." At Retro Kitchen, the owner, a woman in her 40s, examined the photos under a magnifying glass. "Definitely 1960s, she said, nodding. "That red was popular for a few years, but I mostly deal with 1950s pieces. You might want to check with Harold at Handy's." Handy's Appliance Repair, a narrow storefront on the edge of town, was the kind of place that had been there forever, fixing everything from toasters to washing machines. The bell above the door chimed as Sarah entered, the scent of motor oil and old metal filling her nostrils. Harold Hansen, the elderly owner, looked up from a disassembled mixer on his workbench. "Help you, miss?" he asked. Sarah approached with the photos. "I'm hoping you might recognize this oven model." Harold wiped his hands on a rag and took the photos, holding them under his bench light. His expression changed immediately, eyebrows rising in recognition. "Well, I'll be. That's a 1964 Westinghouse Gourmet series. See those handles? Dead giveaway. They only made that particular red from 64 to 67, called it Candy Apple Deluxe." He looked at her over his glasses. "Don't see many of those anymore. Where'd you come across this one?" Sarah's throat tightened. "It's part of a police investigation." Harold's expression sobered. "I see." He studied the photos again, then looked up sharply. "You know, funny thing, I actually sold one just like this. Maybe 3.5 years ago. Don't get much call for vintage ovens, so it stuck in my mind." Sarah's heart began to race. "Do you remember when, exactly?" "Let me check." Harold moved to a shelf lined with old ledgers and ran his finger along the spines until he found 1998. Flipping through pages of careful handwriting, he found what he was looking for. Here we go. April 18th, 1998. Westinghouse Gourmet Series, Candy Apple Deluxe. Cash sale, $450. 5 months before Emma vanished. Sarah gripped the edge of the counter, her mind reeling. "Do you remember who bought it?" "Cash sale, so no name required back then," Harold said. "But I remember the guy. Middle-aged, very particular about wanting that exact color. Said it would match his kitchen perfectly." He adjusted his glasses, thinking. What struck me as odd was he asked all sorts of technical questions. What temperature it could reach, how well it retained heat, the interior dimensions. Most folks buying vintage pieces just want them for decoration or light use. "Can you describe him?" "Average height, brown hair, maybe 40-ish, nothing particularly memorable." "Except how specific he was about the color and those strange questions," Sarah murmured, her hands trembling as she snapped a photo of the ledger entry with her phone. "He even asked about the door sealing tightly." "Interesting timing." Detective Morrison's voice came through the phone when Sarah finished relaying the information. "But Sarah, you have to understand, thousands of people own vintage appliances. This could be purely coincidental. I can't help but feel that someone asking about heat retention and door seals is significant," Sarah replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "I'm not dismissing it. We'll add it to the file. Cross-reference appliance sales with our suspect lists. But without a name or better description, it's not enough to go on." Sarah felt the weight of his words, but the timing still unsettled her deeply. Someone had bought that exact model of oven just 5 months before Emma vanished. Someone who cared about temperature control and tight seals. The implications made her stomach churn. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the photos of the ledger entry on her phone. April 18th, 1998. The date pulsed with significance, even if Detective Morrison didn't see it that way. She felt Mark should know about this development. Whatever their differences, he was still Emma's father and deserved to be kept informed. She dialed his number, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before he picked up. "Hello?" Mark's voice sounded slightly out of breath, as if he had been running. "Mark, it's me. I'm sorry to bother you." "No, it's fine. Are you okay? Did something happen?" "I found something out about the oven. I visited some appliance stores with the photos, and the owner of a vintage repair shop remembered selling that exact model in April 1998, 5 months before Emma disappeared." There was a pause on the other end. Sarah heard Mark shift the phone. "April 1998? That's quite a coincidence." "That's what I thought." The buyer paid cash and asked strange questions about the temperature and how well the door sealed. Mark's voice softened, but his skepticism was clear. Probably dozens of people bought similar ovens around that time. Vintage appliances were trending. Remember that whole retro kitchen movement? Sarah's heart sank. He was brushing it off. "Mark, that's not what struck me," she said, her voice rising. "Who buys an oven and cares about heat retention and door seals unless they're using it for something specific?" He was silent for a long moment. "You're right. It's strange, but it's still just a lead." "I don't know. I feel like we're missing something here." Mark's voice shifted, sounding distant now, as if something had changed in the room. "Where are you, Mark? You sound like you're in a cave or something." "I'm at the cabin, the old place up at Deer Lake." "The cabin." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "I thought you sold that during the divorce." "I was going to," Mark replied quickly, almost defensively. "Had it listed and everything, but when it came time to sign the papers, I just couldn't. Too many memories, you know? All those summers with Emma." Sarah fell silent. She remembered how Mark had promised to sell the cabin. She remembered her relief at not having to fight over the property. The cabin had too many family memories. Teaching Emma to swim off the dock, roasting marshmallows by the outdoor fire pit, the 3 of them cuddling in the loft during thunderstorms. "Sarah, you still there?" "Yeah, I'm here," she whispered. Mark's voice brightened, taking on an almost eager tone. "Listen, why don't you come up? I know today's been hell, and if you need to talk more about these findings, about Emma, about anything, I'm here. We're both dealing with this, and maybe we shouldn't be doing it alone." "I don't know, Mark. I was just about to start dinner. I've got steaks defrosting. You know I hate eating alone, especially on a day like this. I could drive back down and pick you up. It's only 40 minutes. Sarah looked around her empty kitchen, the case files still scattered on the dining table, the silence pressing in on all sides. Maybe he was right. Maybe being alone with her thoughts wasn't helpful right now. "Okay," she said quietly. "If you're sure it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all. I'll be there in 45 minutes. And Sarah," Mark's voice softened, "we'll figure this out. Whatever happened to our baby girl, we'll make sure she gets justice." After hanging up, Sarah wandered into Emma's room. She'd kept it exactly as it was the day Emma had disappeared. The unicorn comforter smoothed over the twin bed, stuffed animals arranged just so, crayon drawings taped to the pink walls. She sat on the edge of the bed, picking up Emma's favorite teddy bear, breathing in the faint scent that still clung to it. The cabin. She hadn't thought about it in months. She'd pushed those memories into a locked box in her mind. They'd bought it the year Emma was born, a rustic but charming place where they could escape Mark's demanding work schedule. Those early years had been good. Mark seemed to relax there. He became the father Emma deserved. He taught her to fish with infinite patience, built her a fairy house in the woods, read her stories by the fireplace. But as his hardware business grew, the cabin trips became less frequent. Work always interfered. Emma would pack her little suitcase and wait by the door, only for Mark to call and cancel. "Next weekend, Princess," he'd promise, but next weekend never seemed to come. Sarah ran her fingers over the bear's worn fur, recalling the fight that had ultimately ended their marriage. It had been Emma's 5th birthday party. Mark had promised to leave work early to be there for the cake, but instead, he showed up after all the guests had gone. Emma asleep on the couch in her party dress, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. "Why doesn't Daddy love me?" she had asked earlier, and Sarah had no good answer. The divorce had been swift and relatively civil. Mark didn't fight for custody. He knew his work schedule made it impossible. He agreed to sell the cabin, or so Sarah had thought. Now, she wondered if it was sentiment, stubbornness, or just another promise he'd broken. A horn honked outside, snapping Sarah from her thoughts. She looked out Emma's window and saw Mark's pickup in the driveway. She placed the teddy bear back on the bed, grabbed her purse, and locked the house behind her. Mark stepped out to open the passenger door for her, a gesture from their early dating days. He looked tired, stress lines deep around his eyes, but he managed a small smile. "Thanks for coming," he said as she climbed in. "I know things are complicated between us, but today we need to be Emma's parents first." Sarah nodded, buckling her seatbelt as they pulled away from the house. She noticed Mark's hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, a nervous energy radiating from him. She attributed it to the emotional weight of the day. They were both barely holding it together. The truck smelled of pine air freshener, coffee, and something else. Underneath, a chemical smell she couldn't quite place. Mark turned on the radio, finding a classic rock station that filled the silence where conversation should have been. "The cabin's in good shape," Mark offered as they left Pine Ridge behind. "I've been fixing it up on weekends. Helps me think, you know? Working with my hands." Sarah watched the familiar landmarks pass by, each one laden with memories of happier times, when they were a family, when Emma was alive and safe, and their biggest worry was which bedtime story to read. The drive to the cabin took them away from Pine Ridge's suburban streets and into the dense Oregon wilderness. Mark navigated the winding forest roads with practiced ease, the truck's headlights cutting through the growing dusk. Tall Douglas firs pressed in on both sides, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out the fading daylight. "Remember the first time we brought Emma up here?" Mark said, his voice softer than it had been all day. "She was only 3, kept asking if bears lived in the trees." Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling slightly. "She made you check under the cabin for bear caves." "With a flashlight and everything," Mark chuckled. Then she decided she wanted to be friends with any bears we found. The familiar rhythm of shared memories eased some of the day's sharp edges. Mark continued talking, his hands relaxing on the steering wheel as he recalled Emma's adventures at the lake. "That first sunfish she caught? God, you'd have thought she'd landed a whale," he said. "She insisted we take 50 pictures of her holding it. She wanted to keep it as a pet." Sarah surprised herself by engaging in the conversation, talking about happy memories despite the morning's horror. "I had to explain catch and release," she added. "Princess Bubbles, wasn't it?" Mark said with a grin. "Princess Bubbles 3. Apparently, there were 2 previous fish royalty we didn't know about. They drove in companionable silence for a few minutes, winding higher into the hills. Sarah gazed out at the familiar landmarks, the old ranger station, now abandoned, the turnoff for the hiking trail where Emma had collected pine cones, the wooden bridge over Cedar Creek where they'd played poo sticks. "I'm glad you kept the cabin," Sarah heard herself say. "I know I was angry during the divorce, but these memories matter." Mark glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "It's the only place that still feels like she's alive, you know? Like she might come running through the door any minute with a jar full of salamanders." As they turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, Sarah's chest tightened with anticipation and dread. The headlights swept across the familiar structure, a modest A-frame with a wraparound deck nestled among towering pines. To her surprise, The cabin looked well-maintained, even improved. The deck had been restained, the windows replaced with newer models, and flower boxes hung from the railings, though they were empty now in late fall. "You've really kept it up," Sarah observed as Mark parked beside the cabin. "Like I said, I'm here most weekends," he replied, turning off the engine. "Started as just maintenance, but then I kind of got carried away. New roof last year. Updated the kitchen." He trailed off, perhaps realizing he was rambling. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine wood and lemon cleaning products. Mark flicked on the lights, illuminating a space that was both achingly familiar and subtly different. The furniture was the same. The overstuffed couch where they'd watched movies together, but there were small changes that marked the passage of time. Movies, the rustic dining table Mark had built himself, everything seemed freshly cleaned and organized. "Make yourself at home," Mark said, heading to the kitchen. "I'll get dinner started. Steaks, okay?" "Sure," Sarah replied absently, already drawn to explore the space. She ran her fingers along the bookshelf, her heart clenching at the sight of Emma's picture books still lined up on the bottom shelf. Goodnight Moon, Where the Wild Things Are, The Velveteen Rabbit, all their bedtime favorites. On the wall, Emma's tiny fishing rod hung on the same wooden pegs, a child-sized life jacket beside it. The living room walls displayed photos she remembered, their family at the lake, Emma's first camping trip, the three of them on the deck during a spectacular sunset. But there were also newer additions, photos of Emma she recognized from their house, ones Mark must have copied and framed after the divorce. "The bathroom's where it always was," Mark called from the kitchen, "though I updated the fixtures." Sarah walked down the short hallway, memories flooding back with each step. The bathroom was indeed updated with new tiles and modern fixtures, but the clawfoot tub Emma had loved remained. Sarah used the facilities and washed her hands, trying to compose herself before dinner. The garage entrance was just past the bathroom. Sarah pushed open the door, intending just to glance at Mark's weekend project space. The garage smelled of motor oil and sawdust, tools neatly arranged on pegboard walls. But it was the large cardboard box in the corner that made her freeze. Westinghouse. The brand name was printed in bold letters across the carton. Her legs turned to jelly as she stepped closer, her breath coming in short gasps. The model number was visible on the side, GS 1964, the same model from Harold's Ledger, the same as the oven in the swamp. But this box looked new, crisp edges and unfaded printing, not 3 years old, not from April 1998. Sarah's vision blurred. She reached out to steady herself against Mark's workbench, knocking over a row of screwdrivers with a metallic clatter. "Sarah?" Mark appeared in the doorway instantly, concern etched on his face. "What's wrong?" She pointed at the box with a trembling hand, unable to form words. Her mind kept seeing that other oven, sealed with adhesive, knowing Emma had been inside. The garage seemed to spin around her. "Oh, Jesus," Mark said, understanding immediately. He rushed to her side, guiding her to sit on a plastic crate. "I'm so sorry. After this morning, seeing any oven must be... God, I should have moved that?" Sarah gasped for air, feeling like she was drowning. It's the same model. Hey, breathe with me." Mark knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it." "Why do you have that?" she managed between gulps of air. "My kitchen oven broke last month," Mark explained, rubbing her back in soothing circles. "This was the only model that would fit the old space. I haven't had time to install it yet." He looked genuinely distressed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't even think about how seeing that would affect you after today." Sarah forced herself to focus on breathing, on the solid feel of the crate beneath her, on Mark's familiar presence. It was just a coincidence. Lots of people had Westinghouse ovens. The fact that Mark had bought the same model meant nothing. She was seeing connections where none existed. Her traumatized mind was making patterns out of random events. Her breathing gradually slowed, her vision clearing. She noticed a stack of beer six-packs against the far wall, at least a dozen cases of Coors. "Planning quite a party?" she asked, desperate to think about anything except ovens. Mark followed her gaze and gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, that's for some fishing buddies coming up next weekend. You know how guys are. I probably overbought, but better too much than running out." He helped her to her feet, keeping a supportive arm around her waist. "Come on, let's get you inside. You should lie down while I finish dinner. This day has been too much for both of us." Sarah let him guide her back through the cabin to the couch, where she sank into the familiar cushions. Mark brought her a glass of water and a blanket, fussing over her with a tenderness that reminded her of better times. "Rest," he said softly. "I'll call you when dinner's ready." During dinner, Sarah picked at her steak while Mark worked his way through his second beer before the meal was even half finished. The dining table, the same one where they'd shared countless family meals, now felt like a barrier between them rather than a gathering place. Mark had grilled the steaks perfectly, medium rare, just how she liked, but Sarah could barely taste the food. "We should talk about what happens next," Sarah ventured, setting down her fork. "Detective Morrison said the DNA results will take 72 hours, but we could start pushing for a more thorough investigation. Maybe hire a private investigator to look into who bought ovens around that time." "You know what I can't stop thinking about?" Mark interrupted, draining his beer and immediately reaching for another from the six-pack he'd placed on the table. "How hard I worked for this family, 60, 70 hours a week sometimes, building that business from nothing." Sarah shifted in her seat. The conversation was drifting into familiar territory, but today felt different. Every word hung heavier between them, like an unspoken question neither of them could ask. Sarah felt the tension build as Mark's voice grew louder and more erratic, the alcohol coursing through him, only making his words sharper. "That's not what we should be focusing on right now," Sarah said, uncomfortably. But Mark wasn't listening. He popped the cap off his third beer with more force than necessary. "You could divorce me the minute things got tough," he muttered, almost accusingly. "Things were tough for years," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "You were never home. Emma barely saw you." "I was providing for my family." Mark's voice rose in frustration. Then he caught himself, taking a long swig of beer, the tension in his body palpable. "But that wasn't enough for you, was it?" "6 months, Sarah," he added, his voice growing bitter. 6 months after the divorce was final and you were already dating." Sarah set down her water glass carefully, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing on her chest. "We were separated for a year before that, Mark. The marriage was over long before the papers were signed." He waved her words away dismissively, his movements becoming looser, more erratic as the alcohol took effect. "Separated? Still married in God's eyes? In Emma's eyes," he muttered. Mark leaned forward, his gaze sharp and intense. "I saw you at Romano's with him. Our place, Sarah. The place I took you for our anniversary. The place where we celebrated Emma's first day of school." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "You were watching me?" "I happened to be driving by," Mark said quickly, but his eyes slid away from hers, avoiding her gaze. "February 14th, Valentine's Day. You wore that blue dress I bought you for Christmas 3 years before." Sarah's unease deepened. The detail about the blue dress was too specific for a casual drive-by. "Mark, have you been following me?" He ignored her question, draining his beer and reaching for another. His fourth or fifth, Sarah had lost count. "You looked happy, laughing at his jokes, letting him hold your hand across the table, like Emma and I never existed." "I need to call Detective Morrison," Sarah said suddenly, standing abruptly. "Let him know where I am and see if there are any updates." She pulled out her cell phone, but the screen showed no signal bars. Of course, they were too deep in the mountains. "Landline?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Disconnected it months ago," Mark said, not looking up from his beer. "Too expensive for a weekend place. Nobody to call anyway." Sarah's pulse quickened. They were 40 minutes from town, no cell service, no landline, and Mark was drinking heavily with his truck as the only vehicle. She moved toward the living room, trying to appear casual. "Where are you going?" Mark's voice had an edge to it. "Just stretching my legs," Sarah said, trying to keep her tone light. "It's been a long day." "Sit down," Mark demanded. It wasn't a request. "We're not done talking." Reluctantly, Sarah returned to her chair, now painfully aware of how isolated they were. Mark's face had flushed from the alcohol, his eyes taking on a glassy quality that reminded her of the worst days of their marriage. "Emma was the only good thing in my life," Mark said, his words slurring slightly. "My perfect little girl, and you took her away from me." "Mark, the divorce had nothing to do with Emma's disappearance," Sarah said, her voice tight. His laugh was cold, humorless. "You have no idea about cause and effect, do you? How one thing leads to another, like dominoes falling." He stood abruptly, swaying slightly, and moved to get another beer from the kitchen. Sarah seized her chance, heading quickly for the door. She'd walk to town if she had to. She'd flag down a car on the main road, anything to get away from this increasingly unstable situation. But Mark was faster than his intoxication suggested. He intercepted her at the door, his body blocking her exit. "Going somewhere?" His voice had dropped to something dangerous. "I want to go home," Sarah said firmly, though her voice shook. "You're drunk and you're scaring me." "Scaring you?" Mark laughed again, that same cold sound. "You want to know what's scary, Sarah? Watching your ex-wife replace you, like you never mattered. Watching her laugh and smile while your daughter asks every day why mommy doesn't love us anymore." "Let me leave, Mark." Sarah tried to sidestep him, but he grabbed her arm, his grip painful. "You want to know about coincidences?" His mask finally dropped completely, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. Not just anger, but something darker, more calculated. "That oven in my garage? I bought it last month to replace the one I put Emma in." The words didn't make sense at first. Sarah's mind refused to process them. "What?" she gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "The oven, in the garage. It's the same model," Mark continued, his grip tightening. "People would notice, ask questions. Where's your oven, Mark? Why is there a gap in your counter?" "No," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "No." "You were at work," Mark said, his tone distant. "The cameras. I was at work when she disappeared from the yard." But Sarah was already shaking her head, denying it. "No. No, you're lying." "No, I'm not lying," Mark said, his voice cold and controlled. "She didn't disappear, did she? Not really. I kept her down there for 3 years while you were out dating, replacing us." Sarah's legs gave out, but Mark's grip kept her upright. She felt her world shattering. "This can't be real. This can't be happening," she gasped. "You're lying," she said again. "You're drunk and cruel and lying." "The basement, Sarah," Mark spat. "She was in the basement, right below us the whole time, while you were filing for divorce, while you were moving on with your life." Sarah tried to scream, but Mark clamped his hand over her mouth. She bit down hard, tasting blood. He cursed but didn't let go. Instead, he dragged her toward the basement door, her feet scrambling for purchase on the wooden floor. "Time you saw where your daughter really was," he snarled, yanking open the basement door. "While you were playing happy families with someone new?" With a firm push, he sent her tumbling down the wooden stairs into the darkness below. Sarah landed hard on the concrete floor, pain shooting through her hip and elbow as her eyes adjusted to the dim light from a single bulb overhead. The room came into chilling focus. To her left was a small room, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with concrete walls painted a faded pink. A child-sized cot with princess sheets sat against one wall. Scattered across a small carpet were children's books, early reader chapter books, elementary math workbooks, a stack of notebooks filled with a child's handwriting, and toys suitable for a 6 to 9-year-old girl. Handmade dolls, art supplies, and a small electronic keyboard lined wooden shelves. Sarah's heart shattered as the truth sank in. Emma had lived here. Her daughter had been here all along. Mark descended the stairs slowly, gripping the railing for balance. Despite his intoxication, he positioned himself to block any escape route, his bulky frame filling the stairway. "Welcome to Emma's home away from home," he said, his voice a mixture of pride and bitterness. 3 years, Sarah. 3 years she lived right here while you were filing papers, going on dates, replacing us. Sarah pushed herself up, her entire body trembling. "You were at work when she disappeared, right?" she asked. "The cameras proved it," Mark interrupted, leaning against the wall. "They didn't show me taking my lunch break at noon, driving home, waiting in the garage. I knew your schedule better than you did. Laundry day. You always started a load right after lunch and stayed inside for at least 30 minutes for the wash cycle." Sarah's mind reeled, trying to reconcile this man, a man who had once held their daughter in the delivery room, who had cried at Emma's first steps, with the monster standing before her. "I'd been planning since the day you filed those papers," Mark continued, his words flowing like venom. "I built this room over weekends when I said I was at the cabin, soundproofed the walls, installed a ventilation system, told Emma I was building her a surprise playroom." He gestured around the space with drunken expansiveness. "The day I took her, I told her Mommy didn't want us anymore. Said Mommy had decided she only wanted one person in her life, and she didn't choose us. Emma cried for you for weeks." "You're a monster," Sarah whispered. "I'm a father who refused to lose his daughter," Mark shouted, then swayed, catching himself against the wall. "I homeschooled her down here, taught her reading, math, science. We had a routine, breakfast at 8, lessons until noon, lunch, then playtime. I was the father you always said I wasn't, present, involved, dedicated." "You kidnapped her," Sarah shouted. "You imprisoned her." "I saved her from a broken home," Mark retorted, his face contorted with rage and pain. "But she never stopped asking for you. Every single day she asked when she could see Mommy, when she wanted to go home. I told her this was home now, but she was stubborn. Just like you." Sarah noticed a crude calendar on the wall, days marked off in crayon, 3 years of marked days. Her knees nearly buckled. "At first she tried to run whenever I opened the door," Mark continued, his voice becoming almost conversational. "So, I had to be careful, keep the basement door locked from the outside. But she got clever as she got older. Started hiding behind the door, trying to squeeze past me. By the time she turned 9, she was getting too smart, too strong." His voice cracked, and Sarah saw tears mixing with the alcoholic flush on his face. "She started threatening to hurt herself if I didn't take her home. Said she'd stop eating, said she'd find ways to make me sorry. My little girl, my sweet Emma, talking about hurting herself because she wanted to leave me. Because you were keeping her prisoner," Sarah screamed. "Because you poisoned her against me," Mark roared back. "Even through the years, even after 3 years, she loved you more. It was always Mommy this and Mommy that. Mommy would let me, and Mommy's looking for me." He stumbled to a small refrigerator in the corner, pulling out another beer from what looked like an endless supply. Sarah's eyes frantically searched for another exit, a weapon, anything. "I always knew how it would have to end if she didn't accept our new life," Mark said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "Part of me hoped, but deep down, I knew." "What did you do?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "It was a Thursday," Mark continued, his hand shaking as he took a long pull from his beer. "She'd been particularly defiant that week, screaming whenever I came down, throwing her books at me. I'd been drinking more, the stress, you understand. That morning, she looked me right in the eye and said, 'I hate you. Mommy will find me, and you'll go to jail forever.'" Mark paused, his hand trembling as he took another drink. I made her favorite juice, apple with just a little bit of grape mixed in. Put the sedatives in it, enough to make her sleep. She drank it during lunch, started getting drowsy during our reading time. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms. I told her there were monsters outside, bad people who wanted to hurt us. Told her she needed to hide in the special hiding place, the oven. She was so sleepy, so trusting even then, climbed right in with her stuffed rabbit. "Stop!" Sarah begged, but Mark continued relentlessly. I turned the heat up slowly, put a chair against the door so she couldn't push it open if she woke up. She never woke up, Sarah. The sedatives made sure of that. Carbon monoxide got her before the heat. With a forceful shove, he pushed her back, causing her to stumble and fall toward the basement stairs. Sarah's body hit the cold concrete floor as her eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light. The room came into focus, and her heart sank as she saw the space around her. A small room, about 10 by 12 feet, with faded pink walls. A child-sized bed, with princess-themed sheets, was against one wall, surrounded by a few scattered toys, children's books, and learning materials. There were notebooks filled with child's handwriting and a small electronic keyboard. The room looked so familiar, yet so wrong. The truth hit her like a wave. Emma had lived here, hidden away, all this time. Mark slowly made his way down the stairs, his movements unsteady. Despite his inebriation, he blocked any path to escape, standing in front of her, a heavy presence in the doorway. "Welcome to Emma's home away from home," he said, his voice cold, laced with both bitterness and pride. 3 years, Sarah. 3 years she lived right here while you were dealing with papers, moving on, replacing us. Sarah's body trembled as she pushed herself up. Her legs felt weak, but she managed to stand, her heart aching for what her daughter had gone through. "You were at work when she disappeared," Sarah spoke, her voice shaking. "The cameras proved that." Mark cut her off. "The cameras didn't show everything. They didn't show the lunch breaks, the drives back home, the times I waited in the garage. I knew your schedule better than you did. Laundry day, when you always stayed inside for at least half an hour while the load was washing." Sarah's mind was reeling. This wasn't the man she had married. This wasn't the person she had trusted with their daughter. Her thoughts raced as she tried to process his words. "I had planned this from the moment you filed those papers," Mark continued, his words filled with an unsettling calm. "Built this room while I said I was at the cabin. I soundproofed the walls. Told Emma I was making a surprise playroom for her." He gestured around the space, the drunken pride in his voice growing. "The day I took her, I told her Mommy didn't want us anymore, that you chose someone else. Emma cried for you for weeks." Sarah's throat closed up, her body shaking with the weight of the revelation. "You're a monster. I'm a father who refused to lose his daughter," Mark shouted, his voice rising. "I homeschooled her down here. We had a routine, breakfast, lessons, playtime. I was everything you said I wasn't, present, involved. You kidnapped her, Sarah. I saved her from a broken home." His face twisted with pain and rage, but his voice softened as he spoke of Emma's struggle. "She never stopped asking for you. Every day she wanted to see you. She wanted to go home. I told her this was home, but she was stubborn, just like you." Sarah's eyes fell to the crude calendar on the wall, days crossed out in crayon. 3 years of her daughter's life marked off in silence. "At first, she tried to run whenever I opened the door," Mark continued, his voice disturbingly matter-of-fact. "But she got clever, hiding behind the door, trying to slip past me. By the time she was 9, she was getting too smart, too strong." Mark paused, his eyes welling with tears as he continued. "She started threatening to hurt herself if I didn't take her home. She said she'd stop eating. She said she'd make me sorry. My little girl, talking about hurting herself because she wanted to leave me. Because you kept her locked away, Sarah whispered, horrified. Mark's voice grew louder, tinged with anger. No, she loved you more, even after all of this. Mommy this, mommy that. Mommy will find me, she kept saying. Mommy's looking for me. Sarah's mind raced as she saw Mark move to a small refrigerator in the corner, pulling out another beer. She searched desperately for any sign of escape. I always knew how it would end if she didn't accept our new life, Mark said softly, almost contemplatively. But I didn't want it to happen like this. Part of me hoped she'd accept it, but deep down, I knew. What did you do? Sarah's voice barely rose above a whisper. It was a Thursday, Mark began, his voice dropping into a steady rhythm. She'd been defiant that week, throwing her books at me, screaming. I'd been drinking more, the stress, you understand. That morning, she looked me right in the eye and said, I hate you. Mommy will find me, and you'll go to jail. He took another sip from the beer, his hands trembling. I made her favorite juice, apple and just a little grape mixed in. Put the sleeping pills in it, enough to make her sleep. She drank it, got drowsy during our reading time. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She felt sick, her body trembling as she held back the bile rising in her throat. I told her there were monsters outside, that bad people wanted to hurt us, Mark continued, his voice becoming colder. I told her she needed to hide in the special hiding place, the oven. She was so trusting, so sleepy. She climbed right in with her stuffed rabbit. Stop! Sarah cried out, her voice breaking. Mark didn't stop. I turned the heat up slowly. I blocked the door with a chair so she couldn't push it open. If she woke up, she never did. The sedatives took care of that. The carbon monoxide got her before the heat could. Sarah closed her eyes, her body shaking as she processed the devastating truth. Mark's confession was almost too much to bear. She struggled to find the words, her mind racing with disbelief at the events she had just learned. Detective Morrison continued, He admits to keeping detailed journals about your movements after the divorce. He documented your daily routines, who you talked to, and even took photos of you without your knowledge. His entries became more hostile and erratic as his struggles with alcohol worsened. Sarah's heart sank as she recalled the times Mark's drinking had escalated. He mentioned following me, Sarah said softly. Morrison nodded. Yes, February 14th, 1999. You were at Romano's with David Carlson from your book club. Mark wrote about that night in detail. He considered it the ultimate betrayal of our family. He mentioned that seeing you at Emma's favorite restaurant with another man was when he decided you needed to be punished. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah as she realized the depth of Mark's obsession and pain. He planned everything meticulously, she whispered. He did, Morrison confirmed. He built the basement room over months, telling people he was renovating the cabin. He soundproofed the walls and installed locks that could only be opened from the outside. When Emma visited, he groomed her to trust him, telling her he was preparing a special surprise for her. Sarah's stomach turned as she learned just how deeply Mark had manipulated Emma. He kept her in that basement for 3 years, didn't he? Yes, Morrison continued, and he even homeschooled her during that time. The beer cans found throughout the cabin indicate he was drinking heavily during those years. He said Emma never stopped asking for you, never stopped trying to escape. By the time she was 9, she began to threaten self-harm if he didn't let her go home. He gave her sedatives in apple juice, Sarah whispered, barely able to speak. The medical examiner confirmed that carbon monoxide poisoning was the cause of death, Morrison said gently. The sedatives ensured she was unconscious. She didn't suffer, at least that's the one mercy in all this. Sarah nodded, her voice breaking. How could he do this? Morrison hesitated for a moment. We found his research on body disposal, on psychological manipulation. He wanted the oven, specifically. because he knew it would affect you. He wanted you to imagine her final moments. He believed you needed to suffer the same way he felt betrayed by you. Sarah wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath as she tried to focus. What charges does he face? Kidnapping, false imprisonment, first-degree murder. With his confession and the physical evidence, he won't see freedom again. Detective Morrison reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over Sarah's. "I'm so sorry we couldn't find her sooner. She was alive for 3 years and we failed her. We all failed her." Sarah's breath hitched as she struggled to absorb the full weight of the situation. She nodded numbly. "I should have found her." A knock on the door interrupted them. An officer entered, giving a brief report. "Detective, the media's gathering outside. They'll need a statement." Sarah stood, her legs unsteady as she made her way to the door. "I'll speak to them," she said quietly. "Other families need to understand. They need to know that sometimes the danger isn't a stranger." Outside the station, Sarah stood before the cameras with Detective Morrison at her side. She gave a short but heartfelt statement about seeking justice for Emma, supporting other families of missing children, and the importance of never giving up hope, even when that hope led to devastating truths. Inside, Detective Morrison walked her to a quieter room, away from the chaos. "We'll have victim support services contact you immediately, counseling, legal advocacy, whatever you need. We'll be with you every step of the way through the trial. Mark will spend the rest of his life behind bars for what he did to Emma." Sarah nodded, feeling numb. "Thank you. Do you have someone who can be with you tonight? You shouldn't be alone." "My sister's driving down from Portland," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison gave her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. "I'll give you some time. Take as long as you need." When the door closed behind him, Sarah collapsed into the chair in the empty room. The silence enveloped her, pressing down on her chest. Her baby had been alive for 3 years while she mourned her as lost. 3 years of birthdays, Christmases, and bedtimes spent in a basement, while Sarah searched desperately in all the wrong places. She pressed her hands to her face, speaking through her tears. "Emma, baby, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't find you. I'm sorry I didn't know. But I promise you, my sweet girl, I'll fight for justice. He'll pay for what he did, and I'll make sure he never hurts anyone again, and I'll always remember you. Not how you died, but how you lived. Your laugh, your smile, the way you saw magic in everything. I'll carry you with me always, my precious daughter. Always." The room seemed to hold her words, her promise, her broken heart. Outside, the business of justice continued, but in that moment, Sarah Whitmore sat alone with her grief and her memories of a little girl in a red velvet dress who had loved her unconditionally, even in the darkness.